Mannat February 12, 2025 written update. Mannat February 12, 2025 written update. Today in Mannat written update, Mannat serves desserts to Mrs. Burman's daughter and her in-laws, who praise the flavors. Her fiancé, impressed by the taste, compares them to authentic French desserts. Meanwhile, Aishwarya pressures Vikrant to finalize a deal with a Singapore client. As Mannat prepares to leave, Mrs. Burman offers her money in gratitude, but Mannat declines. Mrs. Burman is then shocked when her assistant informs her that the desserts were sent to her house. She demands an explanation, and Mannat reveals her face. Furious, Mrs. Burman questions her presence. Mannat explains that she overheard their conversation and, knowing the importance of the occasion, took it upon herself to ensure the desserts arrived on time. She insists she did it out of goodwill, not for money. Mrs. Burman's daughter appreciates Mannat's efforts, insisting she deserves recognition. Mrs. Burman, touched, admits she would do anything for her daughter. Mannat responds that her mother loves her just as much, making this her way of honoring that bond. Mrs. Burman calls Mannat a godsend. Instead of asking for personal favors, Mannat requests Mrs. Burman to give Vikrant another chance. She pleads, reminding her that Mezbani is his lifelong dream. Meanwhile, Aishwarya pressures Vikrant to focus on the Singapore deal. Just then, Mannat calls him. Aishwarya dismisses it as unimportant, but Vikrant answers. Mannat excitedly informs him that Mrs. Burman agreed to reconsider Mezbani. Skeptical at first, Vikrant is shocked when Mrs. Burman confirms it herself. She tells him her office will reach out for a second inspection. Vikrant, overwhelmed, hangs up abruptly. Aishwarya introduces him to the Singapore client, but he outright refuses the deal, citing a bad mood. This leaves Aishwarya and Puneet stunned. Elsewhere, Vikrant interrogates Malika about Mannat's spiked drink incident. Malika hesitates, fearing her mother's reaction. However, Vikrant tricks her into admitting that her mother's PA was behind it. Later, Neetu asks Vikrant if he's okay, but he brushes it off. Mannat and her family celebrate the victory. Shruti is relieved that she no longer has to work with Aishwarya, given how she falsely framed Mannat. Vikrant soon arrives, and Shruti refuses to let Mannat work in his restaurant. Vikrant pulls Mannat aside for a private conversation. Meanwhile, Aishwarya wants to see Vikrant, but Neetu tells her he went to a doctor due to stress. Aishwarya mocks Neetu for being a housewife, implying she wouldn't understand business matters. Neetu silently fumes, thinking that just because their family once received financial help doesn't mean they must tolerate mistreatment forever. Vikrant finally apologizes to Mannat for doubting her, admitting he wrongfully called her a liar and betrayer. Mannat, deeply hurt, expresses her grief. Vikrant vows to find and punish the culprit, but Mannat asks him to drop the matter for her family's sake. He apologizes again, impressed by her selflessness.